was Germany's most advanced fighter aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Meeting it head-on was the British Royal Air Force's brand new fighter, the Supermarine Spitfire. In the Battle of Britain over the English Channel, these two planes would clash for the first time. Which would prove superior? A series of tests and a head-to-head dogfight will demonstrate how they really compared. There are 4 traits which make a great fighter aircraft: handling, performance, firepower, and pilot survivability. Which of these two planes has combined these factors to its best advantage? This was a period in the Second World War before the US and Britain joined forces to fight and defeat Nazi Germany. For the moment, the Brits were on their own. By July 1940, the beginning of the Battle of Britain, the German Messerschmitt had already been successfully tested in combat and was the Nazis' prized possession. But what would the British pilots make of their new, untested Spitfire?
Oh, I loved it. The most beautiful airplane that's ever built, I think. You didn't get into the Spitfire, you strapped it on and flew. The best part was it was so wonderful to handle. It was a viceless airplane. It had no vices at all. You could do anything with it, and it would do anything you wanted it to do.
Comparing the Spitfire's handling to the Messerschmitts requires someone who's flown both planes. And British Royal Air Force pilot Charlie Brown flies these two vintage aircraft in his leisure time.
The Spitfire is the ultimate carefree handling airplane. Getting it off the ground and getting it back onto the ground is a bit of a trick, I grant you. But in the air, it is the most benign airplane of any type that I've ever flown, of any type.
It was the Spitfire's trademark elliptical wings that gave it its responsive handling.
Take a look at those two airplanes. Look at the wing area. The Spitfire's got that wonderful elliptical section on it. And in theory, when you start to maneuver the airplane, you should get less drag. It is one of the things that makes the aircraft more benign, having that large wing area.
The Messerschmitt 109's wings were smaller and weaker than the Spitfire's. What's more, a fluke design feature of the Spitfire gave its pilots an overwhelming advantage. During extreme maneuvers, the wings vibrated heavily, warning that the plane was about to fall out of the sky and giving the pilot ample time to correct. The German Messerschmitt gave no such warning.
The 109 is definitely more of a handful. It is rather less gainly. There is less feedback through the controls. Perfectly fine flying machine, but compared to a Spitfire, it is very difficult.
You had to treat the Messerschmitt as you would treat a diva. You had to handle it with care, just like a raw egg or like something that needs to be loved and cared for.
Because the German Messerschmitt was more difficult to fly, its pilots were often reluctant to push it to the extreme. This fact could shed light on one of the most enduring controversies surrounding the two aircraft. Which could outturn the other?
In a turn, the Spit was better than the Messerschmitt.
I know the Spitfire could outturn the 109. You'll still find the odd 109 pilot who claimed differently, but I'm sure they hadn't found competent Spitfire pilots against them. On 2 occasions, I saved my life by outturning a 109.
So which one was the tighter turner? Despite claims otherwise by Spitfire pilots, there is some evidence to suggest that the 109 could outturn the British fighter. But in a dogfight, only the most experienced Luftwaffe pilot would dare push his plane to the limits. 9 times out of 10, a Spitfire would outturn a Messerschmitt.
A number of times, a Spitfire being chased by Messerschmitts pulled a tight turn, and the Messerschmitt couldn't stay with it. And in some cases, more experienced pilots ended up shooting a Messerschmitt down.
First blood goes to the agile Spitfire. It was much easier to control than the Messerschmitt 109, which required experienced pilots to handle dangerous combat situations. Now, round 2, pilot survivability. A veteran German pilot is about to get into the cockpit of a British Spitfire, and a veteran English pilot into the cockpit of a German Messerschmitt. They've been asked to give their first impressions of their opponent's aircraft. First, Spitfire pilot Peter Fay enters one of the few remaining Messerschmitts in the world, currently undergoing restoration.
I feel very much more confined than I did in a Spit, but the control panel is very similar.
Next, Battle of Britain Luftwaffe ace Hans Eckhard Bob gives his first impressions of the Supermarine Spitfire.
Well, I must admit that I like it. It's pretty spacious in here, it's comfortable, and vision is good all around. Yes, I like this aircraft. I'd like to fly it. When the cabin is closed, you feel safe. But what is also important is your rear view, because that's where the enemy comes from. And when I turn round, I have good visibility on both sides, which is very important.
Visibility, not as good as a Spitfire. And if I look round, yes, I can see, but there's a definite blind spot.
This blind spot was caused by the bulletproof armor plate fitted behind the pilot's head, and many Messerschmitt pilots complained that it made them vulnerable to surprise attacks. This problem was cleverly rectified only after the Battle of Britain by the introduction of Panzer glass taken from German tanks, in place of the thick armor plating and still capable of stopping a bullet. But visibility wasn't the pilot's only concern during the Battle of Britain.
The fuel tank is in front of you, compared to the Messerschmitt, where you have the tank behind and underneath you. If you were hit at the front in the Spitfire, then your face would burn straight away. In the 109, the fire would start at the back. Psychologically, that feels safer.
Right, my petrol tank is hit and I've got to get out in a hurry. It doesn't really matter whether the tank's in front of me or below. If I'm on fire, I've got to get out. And this thing is very heavy. And remember that we've got an airflow of 200 or 300 miles an hour, possibly more. So I have to get that open, and then I've got to get out of this thing. And I can only go this way. So if the flames are that side, hard luck. So I just get out as quick as I can.
Peter thinks it would be very difficult to jump out of a Messerschmitt if it was on fire. Ironically, Hans thinks it would be just as hard to bail out of a burning Spitfire.
I don't think it would be very easy to get out of a Spitfire. I could imagine this half door being pushed against you by the wind. In the Messerschmitt, it would be easy to abandon the plane because the force of the slipstream would help push you out. But luck also plays a part. The tailplane could easily hit you as you bailed out. But this is always a risk.
Although both aircraft were equally difficult to escape from, both pilots agreed the Spitfire was more spacious and had better visibility than the German Messerschmitt. What's more, the Messerschmitt pilots were at a great disadvantage to their British counterparts when it came to landing the aircraft. The German Messerschmitt's landing gear was exceptionally narrow, and this led to frequent crashes on landing.
Flying the Messerschmitt was a big problem for beginners. As far as I know, we lost more pilots on takeoff and landing because of this narrow landing gear than through enemy attacks. Even if you're aware of this fault, it's still a problem. You need to be a good pilot to control a Messerschmitt.
Round 2 goes to the Spitfire as well. In terms of pilot survivability, the British Spitfire is a clear winner. Can the Messerschmitt regain the advantage in round 3? Firepower. During the Battle of Britain, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 led the German aerial assault on southern England. But meeting it head-on over the south coast was the revolutionary Supermarine Spitfire. Which of these two aircraft had the edge when it came to firepower? In 1940, along with the Hurricane, the Spitfire was the best-equipped British fighter with an armament of 8 Browning 303 machine guns, 4 in each wing. But the Messerschmitt had something far more fearsome: 2 deadly 20mm anti-aircraft cannons.
If you have a cannon, you only got to have a couple of shells hit another airplane, and that airplane's out of action, in effect. Whereas bullets, you have to get an awful lot of bullets through that airplane to make it good. I can prove that with you. I mean, on one occasion, I think the last engagement during the Battle of Britain, when I shot down a Ju-88 over Salisbury Plain, I finished up the 11 bullet holes through my airplane, and they'd done no damage at all, although one had gone into the engine, whereas a cannon shell would have knocked me out.
To illustrate what this difference in armament means, experts at the Ordnance Testing Range will now carry out a modern-day test of firepower. This is the Browning 303 machine gun, the same basic design as the one that was fitted to the Spitfire during the Battle of Britain. To get an idea of what damage it would inflict in the air, this marksman is going to use it to strafe a piece of Messerschmitt 109. The aluminum in the frame is the same thickness as the skin of a 109's wing. A Spitfire's Browning machine gun just does not have the firepower to do any serious damage. The bullets have pierced the Messerschmitt's aluminum, but the holes aren't large enough to pose a real threat to the aircraft. A Spitfire was equipped with 8 Brownings, but you would have to be a crack shot to make them count. Shoehorned into the Messerschmitt's tiny wings was this, the terrifying 20mm cannon. The marksman will see what damage something this size can do to a simulated Spitfire wing. The Messerschmitt's 20mm shells have ripped the aluminum to shreds. Compared to the tiny holes made by the Spitfire's machine gun, it is devastating. If this really was part of a Spitfire's wing, the pilot would be bailing out by now.
I was scrambled and got into the cloud. If you're actually in the cloud, you can't see a blind thing until you're totally clear of the cloud. When I came up underneath 5109s, they were sitting there and watching me coming up and rubbing their hands. And they got me before I broke cloud, really, so I didn't know what was happening. They hit me from front and behind at the same time. A cannon shell exploded on the parachute I was sitting on, which put a hunk of metal through my right here, which cut the Achilles tendon. So eventually I sort of managed to bail out and looked around and found the cord and pulled it with my one-legged arm. And very satisfying, that thump when the parachute opens. And then I looked up and I realised what the bang underneath my bottom had been, because the parachute was rather like a colander. It was one mass of holes. And so I came on down, and I was coming down very fast, as you can imagine. And I eventually came out of cloud about 4,000 feet over the most beautiful blue lagoon. And I was drifting towards an island in the middle of this lagoon. And I landed in they had a sort of quagmire in the middle of the island, which all the drains ran into. And I landed right in this. So I traditionally landed in the, as you can imagine. I came to with an Irishman standing over me saying, "What are you?" So I explained in my very basic English what I was. He then carried me to the jetty and the Navy picked me up.
Bob was lucky. He recovered and was back in action in months. Yet his story reinforces that during the Battle of Britain, the German Messerschmitt was clearly superior in terms of firepower. But could it beat the Spitfire in the performance stakes? During the Battle of Britain, Messerschmitts flying from their bases in northern France would typically go head-to-head with intercepting Spitfires at between 15 and 20,000 feet. At this altitude, the Spitfire had a top speed of 355 miles per hour, just 7 miles per hour faster than the 109. But despite the similarity in the two aircraft's performance, the Spitfire's Merlin engine had a major weakness, which undoubtedly cost some RAF pilots their lives during those aerial dogfights of 1940. Aeronautical engineer Peter Grieve tours air shows giving demonstrations of his Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. He bought it as a wreck 6 years ago and restored it to full working condition. And he can use it to illustrate the Spitfire engine's potentially disastrous tendency to cut out during steep forward dives. The problem occurred because the Spitfire's Merlin engine had a carburetor, whereas the Messerschmitt was fuel injected. With fuel injection, a pilot can do any aerobatics and the engine will keep running smoothly. But a carburetor's performance is affected by changes in G-force, which occur during certain extreme maneuvers.
What happens when you put a Spitfire into a steep dive is a bit like the feeling you get when you go over a humpback bridge in the car. Everything gets thrown upwards. In much the same way, on this Merlin carburettor, the fuel gets thrown upwards in the float chamber, starving the engine of fuel momentarily and making it splutter. The next thing which happens is much more serious. Because the floats which control the fuel flow into the carburettor are being thrown around, it makes the carburettor think that it's empty, and the fuel pump just piles fuel into it, in turn flooding the engine, which will make it cut out.
This kind of steep forward dive is known as a negative G maneuver because it reverses the effects of gravity. Using this wartime engine, Peter can demonstrate that the principle of negative G applies in exactly the same way as it would to the Merlin. When he turns the carburetor upside down, the engine cuts out.
Imagine that happening on your aircraft at 16,000 feet.
Crafty 109 pilots soon learned to exploit this failing of the Spitfire by deliberately forcing their opponents to follow them into a negative G dive.
It was a great advantage for us that we had a fuel injection system and the Spitfire was only equipped with a carburetor. When we had a Spitfire behind us, which we couldn't shake off, we would go into a steep forward dive, and the negative G would starve their carburetor, so we could dive quickly and the Spitfire couldn't keep up.
It was a fault that Spitfire pilots had to live with until well after the Battle of Britain. But the Spitfire wasn't the only one with a handicap. The German Messerschmitt had a crippling problem with fuel too, or more precisely, the lack of it. A major disadvantage that the Messerschmitt faced during the Battle of Britain was its limited flying range. The tank only held enough fuel for about 15 minutes fighting over southern England before the pilot had to head for home, which severely restricted the plane's efficiency as a weapon of war.
We had a lot of problems, and we often had to terminate our attacks because we ran out of fuel. The red warning light would come on, and you'd know you only had 10 or 15 minutes left. Critical if you hadn't started your return flight by then. You'd hear anxious cries over the radio from fellow pilots when they saw the warning light come on. From time to time, people had to make crash landings. It was a big problem for us, a big handicap.
In performance terms, it is a tie. Although the Spitfire narrowly won rounds 1 and 2, handling and pilot survivability, the German Messerschmitt dominated hands down when it came to firepower. There is really nothing to separate these two aircraft. But coming up, the final showdown, a typical dogfight between the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt. In the Battle of Britain, dogfights were dramatic and brutal. In 1940, it was quick, dirty combat. Whoever had the height, speed, and most importantly, the element of surprise, was more likely to kill and live to fight another day. For the first time, this modern simulation reveals how these World War II fighters would have performed in a typical Battle of Britain dogfight. The German strategy would have been to send a pair of Messerschmitt 109s to attack targets in southern England. The defending British Air Force's reaction would have been to send up a pair of Spitfires to intercept. This dogfight is seen from the cockpit of the second of the Messerschmitts. The four aircraft vie for position. Because of their restricted rear visibility, it is imperative that the Messerschmitt pilots get behind the Spitfires if they want to stand a chance of winning this dogfight. The Messerschmitts get the advantage they need, and a chase ensues. The Spitfire pilots, all too aware of the deadly firepower from their attackers' superior 20mm cannons, use maximum power to stay just out of firing range. But as the two aircraft are roughly equal in terms of top speed, the Spitfires cannot increase their lead any further than that. Now the Spitfire's supreme handling comes into its own. The RAF airmen attempt a series of evasive maneuvers to try and shake off the Messerschmitts. However, the one direction they cannot go is down. In a forward dive, their carburetor engines would cut out with disastrous consequences. Instead, they climb sharply and pull an inverted turn. But the Luftwaffe pilots anticipate this and have now closed to optimum firing range. A burst from the lead Messerschmitt's powerful 20mm cannon puts a shell through the Spitfire's fuel tank. Aware of the horrifying prospect of the tank blowing up in his face, the RAF pilot has two choices: bail out or make an emergency landing. Victory for the Germans seems certain, but before they can turn their attentions to finishing off the second Spitfire, a setback. The red lights come on in their cockpits, warning them that fuel is low. They have to head back to their base in northern France, and they assume the second Spitfire will return to its airfield in England. It would prove to be a costly oversight. Caught up in his success, the Messerschmitt No. 2 has made a grave mistake. He has neglected to spot the second Spitfire making a surprise counterattack from above, and so failed in his duty to protect the Messerschmitt leader at all costs. The leader's plane is now doomed. The second Messerschmitt pilot now has no option but to head back to base alone. The conflict has ended on equal terms, typical of many of the dogfights during the summer of 1940. In fact, the Spitfire and Messerschmitt were so evenly matched that this contest ends in a tie. As in many battles, the only real deciding factor was the man at the controls.
In the end, a lot depends on the pilot. If you imagine an experienced pilot flying the 109 compared with an inexperienced Spitfire pilot, then the pilot of the 109 would be superior. If the situation was reversed, the Spitfire pilot would be superior. It always depends on who's flying the plane.
You never knew what you were doing. You had a gun sight, and providing that little dot in the middle of the gun sight was where you wanted it to be, how you got there was quite incidental. That is why you had to learn to fly the airplane first, and why these chaps who arrived with 7 hours flying the Spitfires hadn't a hope.
By September 1940, after 3 months of conflict, the Germans realized that without aerial superiority, plans to invade England were futile. Many historians maintain Britain won the battle, but it may be more accurate to say that it was a stalemate. The Germans did not win, and the British did not lose. There's trademarked elliptical wings that gave it its responsive handling.
Take a look at those two airplanes. Look at the wing area. The Spitfire's got that wonderful elliptical section on it. And in theory, when you start to maneuver the airplane, you should get less drag. It is one of the things that makes the aircraft more benign, having that large wing area.
The Messerschmitt 109's wings were smaller and weaker than the Spitfire's. What's more, a fluke design feature of the Spitfire gave its pilots an overwhelming advantage. During extreme maneuvers, the wings vibrated heavily, warning that the plane was about to fall out of the sky and giving the pilot ample time to correct. The German Messerschmitt gave no such warning. It was Germany's most advanced fighter aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Meeting it head-on was the British Royal Air Force's brand new fighter, the Supermarine Spitfire. In the Battle of Britain over the English Channel, these two planes would clash for the first time. Which would prove superior? A series of tests and a head-to-head dogfight will demonstrate how they really compared. There are 4 traits which make a great fighter aircraft: handling, performance, firepower, and pilot survivability. Which of these two planes has combined these factors to its best advantage? This was a period in the Second World War before the US and Britain joined forces to fight and defeat Nazi Germany. For the moment, the Brits were on their own. By July 1940, the beginning of the Battle of Britain, the German Messerschmitt had already been successfully tested in combat and was the Nazis' prized possession. But what would the British pilots make of their new untested Spitfire?
Oh, I loved it. It's the most beautiful airplane that's ever built, I think.
109 is definitely more of a handful. It is rather less gainly. There is less feedback through the controls. Perfectly fine flying machine, but compared to a Spitfire, it is very difficult.
You had to treat the Messerschmitt as you would treat a diva. You had to handle it with care, just like a raw egg or like something that needs to be loved and cared for.
Because the German Messerschmitt was more difficult to fly, its pilots were often reluctant to push it to the extreme. This fact could shed light on one of the most enduring controversies surrounding the two aircraft. Which could outturn the other?
In a turn, the Spit was better than the Messerschmitt.
I know the Spitfire. You didn't get into the Spitfire, you strapped it on and flew. The best part was it was so wonderful to handle. It was a viceless airplane. It had no vices at all. You could do anything with it, and it would do anything you wanted it to do.
Comparing the Spitfire's handling to the Messerschmitt's requires someone who's flown both planes. And British Royal Air Force pilot Charlie Brown flies these two vintage aircraft in his leisure time.
The Spitfire is the ultimate carefree handling airplane. Getting it off the ground and getting it back onto the ground is a bit of a trick, I grant you. But in the air, it is the most benign airplane of any type that I've ever flown. Of any type.
It was the Spitfire